So if you've played Yu-Gi-Oh for even within the past 10 years, you know that the extra deck plays a vital role in the game, and although it was formerly known as the Fusion deck, additions such as Synchros, XYZs, and Link monsters have drastically changed the Yu-Gi-Oh landscape. And it's why we call the extra deck zone instead of the Fusion deck zone. But we haven't gotten a new Yu-Gi-Oh extra deck mechanic in a while, and I'm glad. I think that there shouldn't be a new extra deck mechanic, since I personally think that Yu-Gi-Oh has become overly dependent on releasing new extra deck mechanics in order to keep the game fresh. That, and I think the extra deck is getting a bit too cluttered, but of course I'll get into that in a bit. So to focus on the point, I think Yu-Gi-Oh has become too over-reliant on introducing new extra deck mechanics, and it really does feel like Yu-Gi-Oh has only managed to stay fresh and new mainly by introducing new extra deck mechanics in order to keep things interesting. And I think Konami has relied too heavily on this, and I'm worried that Konami hasn't really figured out how to keep the game fresh without this extra deck mechanic, which is concerning because now that Konami seems to have stopped making new extra deck mechanics, it does pose the question, where do we go now? How do we keep the main Yu-Gi-Oh TCG new and interesting without introducing a new extra deck monster? And this is something that I don't quite know the answer to. Think about it, we focused way too much on the next extra deck mechanic release that we haven't really thought about how to keep Yu-Gi-Oh fresh outside of introducing a successor to the current extra deck monster. And if you look back at the Yu-Gi-Oh anime series, each series had a unique extra deck mechanic that it would introduce and focus on. For example, Yu-Gi-Oh 5Ds introduced and focused on Synchro monsters, while shows like Yu-Gi-Oh Zexal focused on XYZs. And when you heard about these shows when they were coming to their respective end, you would almost immediately think about what would the next extra deck mechanic be in the next Yu-Gi-Oh show. And you would pretty much know that the new extra deck mechanic introduced in the show would inevitably be introduced into the actual physical card game. And the only exception to this trend is the show Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s, which has not introduced a new extra deck mechanic. And it's what brings us to our current predicament of how we keep the game fresh without a new extra deck monster. But if I were to give my best shot at solving this issue, I would say that we should not just cave in and incorporate a new extra deck mechanic. Instead, I think we should focus on innovating gameplay mechanics, or even coming up with a new archetype-based strategy. And an example could be having Konami finally focusing on strengthening their anti-meta strategies, which could finally shake up and pose a threat to the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh meta. And I think it would be beneficial since I think the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh meta has grown incredibly stale and it definitely needs opposition in order to improve. However, I've done a whole video on this topic and it's called The Importance of the Yu-Gi-Oh Anti-Meta. So feel free to check it out since this does relate to this topic, and I think it's our best way at keeping Yu-Gi-Oh fresh. And it's my best attempt at providing an alternative as opposed to having a new extra deck mechanic. But aside from Konami's over-reliance on extra deck mechanics, we also have too many of them in my opinion. And this is mainly due to there being 4 different main types of extra deck monsters that are in your extra deck from the start of the duel. And you furthermore have pendulums which can wind up in your extra deck. And there's only so much space for all of these extra deck monsters. And let's face it, the extra deck is a bit oversaturated and there's not enough space to fit all of these extra deck monsters that you would want for a deck. While some players have proposed increasing the number of extra deck monsters to 20, I think it's only incentivizing Konami to create more extra deck mechanics in an already oversaturated extra deck format. Instead, I think Konami should focus on refining the current extra deck mechanics that are present in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the immediate thing that I think of are pendulums. And I think Konami should focus on a standard rule for pendulum summons, mainly because pendulums have had a bit of a shaky history when it comes to changing up the rules for how the pendulum summon works. I won't go into too much detail for the sake of brevity, but pendulums have had many changes to the pendulum rules where you used to put pendulums in a completely separate zone, which changed up the board layout. And they also had a change with how many pendulum monsters you could pendulum summon from your hand or from your extra deck. And this sort of flip-flopping does make it feel like Konami pushed out pendulums for the sake of releasing another extra deck mechanic, mainly because of their half-baked strategies and because of their ever-changing rules. Konami needs to make it clear that the rules like this will not change in the future, since it's important to keep some sort of consistency. And think about it, if the rules constantly change, how are newer casual players going to feel when they pick up the game? It's going to be unbelievably confusing, and this is why I think Konami should mainly stop making extra deck mechanics, and it's primarily because of things like pendulums. The concept felt so forced and so unnatural, and the changing pendulum rules really drove the sentiment that Konami didn't really know what they were doing with pendulums. And I guess this is the main reason why I made this video. It's the feeling that Konami seems to be cranking out extra deck mechanics for the sake of trying to keep the game new and interesting. However, they failed to realize that they've been forcing these mechanics for years, and it really does feel like the quality between each new extra deck mechanic has greatly diminished because of how poorly thought out the concept is. Just look at Links. They're basically synchro monsters without having to use a tuner monster for their summon. You can easily spam out Link monsters, which makes it easier for you to go into your combos since they have incredibly powerful search, summon, and even draw effects. And I really think if Konami just took some time to think things out a bit more, I think they could have avoided mistakes with things like pendulums. And I think they could have avoided the poorly thought out broken nature of Link monsters. So what I'm saying is, I think Konami should not make a new extra deck mechanic because I think they're running out of ideas, and it's really showing because of how problematic or broken these new extra deck mechanics are. And I think these poorly thought out spam heavy extra deck mechanics can unintentionally boost the power creep because of the potential loopholes that poor card design can bring to the table. And just to be clear, I think Konami should stop making extra deck mechanics because they feel too forced and they're interfering with other potentially creative ideas for Yu-Gi-Oh! But yeah, that pretty much wraps up my thoughts for this video. And again, this is something that has been on my mind for a while, and the extra deck mechanic really does feel like a tired concept that has been beaten into the ground. And it's about time for a new approach that will keep Yu-Gi-Oh! New and interesting. And while I appreciate the effort that Konami has placed into making these mechanics, I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just oversaturated with them. But let me know what you think. Do you agree or disagree with what I said? Are there too many extra deck mechanics? And how do you think we can keep the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG interesting without them? Let me know in the comments below. But with that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer 1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.